Okay, thank you everybody for joining this evening. I'm Carol Stringer. I'm the agriculture agent here in Fulton County. And we have Dr. Casey Ritz here this evening to talk to us about small flock poultry nutrition. Dr. Ritz is a professor of poultry science and an extension specialist at the University of Georgia. This is the third webinar in our 4-part series. If you guys are interested, you can always go back to the Eventbrite main page and register for next week's topic as well. And you can also find the recordings of the previous webinars in the series on our YouTube page. And I'll put those links in the chat box while we're going through our presentation this evening. Next week is going to be laying hen management and behavior, I believe. As well,
yeah,
just to
I think that's
that in. Yeah, okay.
That's right.
All right, so just for the housekeeping here, I'll try to remain muted. And if you have any questions as you think of them, put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the webinar. All right, so that's it. Go ahead, Dr. Ritz.
All right, thank you very much, Carol. And welcome everyone. I appreciate you being a part of our training this evening. Tonight, let's talk a little bit about poultry nutrition, and we're going to kind of cover it from a number of angles so that you understand more fully why it really is important what we feed our chickens and that they get the best, have the best nutrition possible. I do want to make a note that Dr. Justin Fowler, one of our former poultry nutritionists, helped with presentation or the formation of this presentation. Let's see. I didn't realize that slide was there. How I missed that. Let me jump ahead a little bit. When it comes down to feeding chickens, in reality, we are it's almost like feeding a dinosaur. In fact, some would say that our modern chickens may very well have maybe progenitors of some of the earlier dinosaurs and that kind of thing. But certainly they have very similar properties. Chickens are omnivores. In other words, they eat anything essentially that they can get in their mouth. They do have a short GI tract. They're not like a cow or a sheep that have multiple stomachs that can utilize lots of grass and fibers and things like that. And so there are some restrictions that we kind of have with chickens just from their physiology. So we have I've shown this slide before, and essentially what we have, if we compare the wild chickens that are the ancestors of our modern commercial birds that are still alive and well in Southeast Asia, if we compare them to our commercial industry, we have very different kind of investment really into those types of chickens. And our backyard birds really need to be somewhere in the middle. We don't want them to be true scavengers. We don't want them to have to search for their food because in a backyard flock scenario, they will not find everything they need. And certainly we're not to the scale of a commercial operation and the need for some of the aspects there. So our backyard birds need to be somewhere in the middle between these two types of poultry systems. And nutrition, really plays a huge role. I mean, everything that an animal or plant becomes really is from the food that they eat. And making sure that we have optimal feed is going to ensure that we can meet the productivity or the genetic potential that our birds have. You know, our backyard birds typically are egg layers. And sometimes some folks will get some meat birds, but we want to make sure that they have all the nutrition they need to carry out normal functions, whether it be body maintenance or for any physical activity that they have, reproduction, that kind of thing. So we want to make sure we have sufficient nutrition for that. And feed, if you do the economics, feed is the most expensive input to any of our animal production. It's about 70% of the costs that it takes to raise chickens, whether it's in a small flock or in a large commercial operation. So with that being said, then it only helps us if we have a well-balanced diet, plenty of good, clean, cool water that they can consume, and then be the best that they can be when it comes to being a good chicken. Well, genes, not to get too scientific, but genes and the genetic makeup that all organisms have are essentially made up of proteins. And if we think of these proteins as building blocks, or some of these nutrients as building blocks, they help us to build the chicken. So picture down there in the corner of a Lego brick chicken. Each component of that bird, whether it be from a protein or a fat or a carbohydrate, well, all those nutrients that they receive when they eat, they need those in order to, and they need to be available at specific times in order to produce the chicken that we have. And so if we don't have the right amount of each of these nutrient bricks, we can't construct a chicken according to its genetic instruction. So, and not to, we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail, but we have our protein, fat, carbohydrate, minerals, vitamins, water, all the same things that we have that we need for good nutrition. We also have for our chickens. And there are some things, some essential components, nutrients that are a little bit different from us. They have some specific fat requirements. They have some vitamins requirements that we don't always have, and things like that. But certainly those building blocks all need to be included. Well, I thought what I'd do, we'd run through just a little bit of chicken anatomy to help you understand, how this nutrition is impacting the bird, and kind of where they're deriving some of that from. So we'll start with the crop. So we're gonna start here at the top. If you can see my pointer, this is the crop. When they first consume food, that's where the feed goes to, and then we'll go on down through. This is the proventriculus. Or the true stomach. The gizzard is essentially the chicken's teeth, and then there's the small intestine, and then we'll talk about these two, call them ceca, these cecal pouches. We'll talk about their purpose too. So the crop is essentially a balloon, for lack of a better term, that's where feed and water is initially stored when the chickens eat. Now, if you watch your chickens, they often will engorge, or when they have a meal, they'll take it all in all at once, and then they'll just kind of pick around for a period of time, almost like a cow. A cow can fill up with grass, it goes down, lays down, chews its cud. The chickens don't chew their cud, but they consume in meal format as well. And so the crop plays a role in that storage. From there, it goes into what we would consider the true stomach. It's called the proventriculus, and this is where acids are added. Some of the enzymes for fat digestion will come into there. And then from there, it goes into the gizzard, which is really, as I mentioned before, that's kind of the teeth of the bird. And that, because it's such a large, strong muscle, as it moves, it grinds the food. And so it's another important part of the digestive system. I might have trouble saying that all night. But the goal of these two portions of the stomach, we'll call them the stomach portions, is to make that food to where it becomes more soluble so it can then be absorbed into the body. So that's the purpose of that stomach and the gizzard, is to grind the food to a particle size that the bird can utilize it. From there, we go into the small intestine, and this is where the real work of digestion begins. This little loop of intestine is called the duodenal loop, and this is where the pancreas neutralizes the acids that were put in by the stomach. And the pancreas, if you've never seen chicken's pancreas, this is it right here. This is organ in between this intestinal loop, and so that's where that's where insulin, and that's where bicarbonate is generated, and where some of these digestive enzymes can start to work as the pH of the intestinal fluid then becomes more neutral. So that's a very important part of the digestion process. From there, we go into the other two sections of the intestine, the jejunum and the ileum, and this is where there are a lot of finger-like projections, and they're called villi, and they're microscopic. This is a microscope, a micrograph showing these little tiny finger-like projections. And what they are is they increase the surface area. So all those nutrients that are in the food that are now in small chemical form can then be absorbed into the blood. The large portal vein, I should have warned you, this is a few graphic pictures, but this is a big, this is called the portal vein. This is the nutrients that are absorbed in the intestine go into the blood system right here, which takes all these nutrients into the liver and then on into the absorbed into the body. Part of this, when we call this kind of the area between the jejunum and the ileum, is it's called the residual yolk sac. This is actually where the yolk was attached to the chick in the egg, and you'll have this little residual knob, essentially the belly button of a chicken, if you want to call it that. Sometimes actually this is an area of infection in birds, and sometimes they'll have what we call a residual yolk sac, or that's a little more pronounced than it should be, and sometimes that can be an issue with some infection. From there, we go into these two blind pouches called ceca, and they are essentially the equivalent of like the colon of a horse. There's a lot of microbial populations there that can absorb and decompose, break down fibers. Chickens really can't, and birds really can't derive a lot of nutrition from fiber. Think, for example, grass or hay or anything like that. They really can't derive any nutrients because their body isn't designed to do that, and they really don't. Ceca really don't function on any scale for them to really be of any great real benefit to them. But the ceca do. That's where some additional water absorption takes place and things such as that. They do have a little bit of a colon, a large intestine, not very big. This is really the last place that electrolytes or water can be absorbed before the waste is expelled from the body. And then we have the cloaca, or sometimes called the vent. This is the common exit. This is where fecal material, crystallized urine from the kidney. And this is the white caps on chicken manure or bird manure. That is their urine. That's the equivalent of their urine. They don't excrete liquid urine, they excrete uric acid. So that's this common openings where the urine and the feces, and then the egg also passes, of course, through that common opening. And so it's sometimes that can be an issue. Sometimes there can be incidences of infection or things like that associated with that because of the common opening that is there. Well, this whole process, we call it metabolism. And this is where, the birds are going to get nutrition out of their feed through the digestive system and then into the blood, where it's converted into all the different forms of energy that it needs for growth and development. Well, energy is the number one thing, really. That's really why we're feeding them they need that energy for growth and then for development. So when we talk about energy, we're really talking about calories. Just like when we think of, well, how many calories are in this snack we're eating, or how many calories am I going to burn when I exercise? So calorie is the heat required the technical term is the heat required to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree, and that then is converted into a unit of energy. So a food calorie, which is really a kilocalorie, is the equivalent to 4,100 joules of energy, or the depiction here is 4,000 apples falling 3 feet. Newton and his gravitational studies and things. A food calorie, to burn a food calorie, is the equivalent of 4,000 apples dropping 3 feet. So let's take a can of soda. This is Dr. Fowler's. He loves telling this part. If you take a can of soda, there's enough energy in that can of soda for the equivalent of a tank falling 3 feet. And if from a body firing and digestion and energy standpoint, that's amazing to think about, that how much real food energy is in some of the foods that we eat. To take it a little bit further, there's enough energy in a can of soda to charge 31 cell phones, or there's enough energy in a can of soda to be the equivalent of a grenade exploding. All different ways of showing how energy is expressed, but that energy that's in that food, there's all that energy that can be used to power or produce something. And so that's what we're trying to show there. That's why it's important that we have all the energy that the bird needs, because that really is the most important component of their feed. So we need to balance. Yes, everybody needs protein, and yes, we need a little bit of fat in the diet and all those different kinds of things, but it kind of depends on what we feed our birds, depending on the condition or the age that they are and the type of bird that they are. Some birds need high calorie feeds, such as our baby chicks. They need high calorie, high protein. And so we need to make sure that we're providing that. When our hens get older, they don't need as much energy or as many calories to maintain themselves. And so we need to consider that as well when it comes to nutrition. But we need to meet all these different parameters. Their basic maintenance for their body based on temperature or the environment that they live in. If they're a growing chick, or they're a mature hen, their level of physical activity, all these things very similar to us play a role in how much nutrition our hens need. Well, certainly there can be cases where we have a nutrient imbalance. And unfortunately, we see a lot of this with small flocks. And often I think it's because people don't really understand nutrition as much as they perhaps should for their birds. But we can certainly have cases where we have all the energy a bird needs, but if there isn't enough protein in the diet, then the bird won't be able to construct those building blocks. We could also have plenty of protein, but then not enough energy to utilize that protein. So down here, I have pictures of 4 birds. And believe it or not, all 4 of those birds are the same age, came from the same hen. It's just a matter of, did they get all the feed they need? Did they get a balanced diet, or did they have an imbalanced diet? And so this is such a graphic picture of how poor nutrition can really affect the growth and performance of our birds if we're not careful. Well, I thought what I'd do is take you through a feed sample or a feed label, and we'll just talk about some of these things quickly, different components of a feed label. First off, we have for chicks, and I recommend that you start any chicks off with a medicated feed. And essentially this medicated feed has a coccidiostat included in it. And this is to help control the coccidiosis or coccidia parasite that is, everywhere in the world essentially. And if you don't give your chicks an opportunity to get a good start, if they get bombarded with parasites right away, they sometimes don't do well. And so I recommend a medicated starter feed. And so that's what this nicarbazine is. It's a coccidiostat that's included in a chick starter feed. Well, let's look down here at protein. Crude protein, no less than 22%. That's the recommended level of protein, percentage of protein that we need to start our chicks off. Anything less, again, they don't have enough of the building blocks that they need for good bone and muscle development as they mature. Part of that protein is the need for methionine and lysine. And the reason that we add those is because they are limiting. And I think I do have a slide on that. So protein are building blocks. We talked about that. They're composed of these amino acids. And the limiting ones mean that the diet typically will not meet their requirement that they need for those specific amino acids or protein building blocks. And poultry are different from cattle and sheep. They all have some of their own basic different needs, but poultry in particular have a need for additional methionine and lysine. So if we feed a bird a typical corn soybean diet, the building blocks that are limiting or in short supply are those methionine and lysine. That's why we include them in the diet. Okay, we have crude fat then, and with a requirement of no less than 4%. Well, why are we adding fat? Fat, it's a long-term storage of energy. We can store energy in the fat that birds will deposit, long-term energy storage, and so it's certainly something that improves the handling qualities, the palatability of the feed. Yes, chickens, though not like us, they certainly can taste their feed. They can tell if something is kind of an off flavor, and we know that they like a certain level of fat in the feed, and so that's why it's included. It's also a good source. We consider it a cooler source of energy in hot weather when birds don't feel like eating because they're too busy panting trying to stay cool. They can utilize some of their fat stores as energy in those situations. And one of the limiting or essential fatty acids is the linoleic fatty acid for poultry. I think we've talked about this before, but fat contributes to the color and flavor of eggs. And, we can ask the question, why are some eggs yolks darker than others? And it has to do with the fat soluble molecules in the food that they eat, whether it be, yellow color from corn or some of those xanthophylls from grasses, or the really bright colored carotenoids that come from beta-carotenes that come from marigold flowers, for example. And so these are really delicate molecules that can work as also as antioxidants. But the example here of the two different colors of yolk, you have the one on the left, which is either it looks like a sorghum. I thought it was a wheat. Wheat would do kind of very similar color of yolk. So you have a wheat sorghum diet on the left, and then a corn diet on the right. And because of the uh, color molecules that are in the different types of feed, that's going to play a direct role in the fat coloration that appears in the yolk. We've showed this slide before, and this kind of talks about flavor as well. Flavors are, of course, fat soluble. And so depending on what our birds consume, it also can impact the flavor of the fat that's in the yolk. And the example that I'll show you or talked about here is example is fish meal. Fish meal is a very good protein source for poultry. They can consume it very well. The problem is you feed too much fish meal, the yolks start tasting fishy because of the fat soluble molecules that contain that fish oil reach the yolks and start tasting like fish. And so that's something you don't want. So here's a quiz for you. I want you to select the yolk which you think came from a healthy hen and which yolk came from a hen that wasn't healthy. I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. Anybody want to take a guess?
We've got a few people saying that all of them are healthy. Number 2 is unhealthy. And number 3 is healthy.
The answer is they're all healthy, right? Remember, that color is not an indication of health. That color is the indication of the food source. So that just means the bright, deep orange color is obviously that hen had a lot of access to greens. And so some of those xanthophylls came through, into the yolk. The one in the middle, that'd be typical corn soybean diet. And then the one on the right is other additional inputs from the feed that they eat. But the answer is they're all healthy. You can't tell by looking at a yolk whether a hen is healthy or not. And in reality, the industry, depending on where you live in the world, we can formulate chicken diets to essentially meet any color of yolk that we want. And this is an example of a yolk fan that the industry can use that can help them determine the amount of chlorophyll or xanthophylls that they need to add to a chicken diet to achieve the color of yolk that they're looking for. Okay, back to our feed label. The next one says crude fiber not more than 3%. Well, we're not really feeding fiber, but it's associated with the carbohydrates. So essentially saying we don't want to feed something that is too high in fiber because birds really can't utilize that fiber. So really those carbohydrates are what we're looking for. And these are all the different types of sugars that are in food, natural sugars, simple sugars like glucose and fructose, all the way to the more complex carbohydrates like starch and cellulose and things like that. The starch is what we're looking for. Starch is what chickens can use as an energy source. And so these carbohydrates, quick source of energy, just like for us, where fats are slower source of energy, carbohydrates, quick source of energy, and we can store some of this carbohydrate energy, sugar energy in the muscles and in the liver. But glucose, that basic unit of carbohydrate and of energy, is what is required to fuel all the cells in the body. And that's the same for us. That's why there's no essential dietary carbohydrate, because everything that we eat from a carbohydrate standpoint gets broken down into glucose. That is essentially the lowest level of carbohydrate that our body uses for energy. And the chickens are the same. And so we want those chicken diets to have lots of starch and minimal amount of fiber. And so the starchy cereal grains like corn, wheat, barley, these are going to provide the bulk of the calories that our chickens need for their growth and development. And if we include other things that aren't as readily digestible remember they have a really short digestive tract. So if we add things that don't kind of fit in this category, we can end up with gut binding kind of concerns, or we increase the viscosity or the flowability of food going through the chicken. We can actually cause problems by having too much fiber or feeding them things that don't match with their short digestive system. Okay, what's next? Salt, a minimum of very specific amount of salt, 0.3 to 0.4% salt. We don't want their feed to be too salty. That'll back them away. And then we also have our calcium, phosphorus, and our vitamin mineral premix. These are kind of often all added together as part of the formulation of the diet. And these vitamins are really, really important if you really think about it. Essentially a vitamin these are chemicals that aid in our metabolism. Some of them help prevent some of the clinical diseases, even in us. Back a long time ago when vitamins were being first discovered, they were called vital amines. And essentially they were components of nitrogen compounds they found that helped cure some of the early diseases that they were noticing due to nutrition deficiency. The vitamins, just like us, they can be divided into fat soluble and water soluble, which means then that, for example, the fat that they consume, we can increase the level of these vitamins through fat sources. And so vitamin A, D, E, and K are all important for chickens, just as they are for us. Poultry don't require vitamin C. They don't utilize vitamin C well at all. So that's not a concern. Really, the only reason we would add vitamin C or use vitamin C often is sometimes to help flush bad bacteria out of the digestive system. But sometimes we use it almost as a medication, but they don't utilize it for their growth and development. A lot of feed ingredients are naturally going to have these vitamins, but oftentimes we need to, they don't always meet the full requirement. And so we meet those requirements by adding a vitamin mineral premix, almost like a multivitamin that we might take. We add those premixes to their feed to make sure they have all the vitamins that they need. Sometimes deficiencies that you will see, and actually these are pretty common in backyard flocks. Vitamin A deficiency, you'll see sometimes some discharge from around the head, swelling of the eyes, some bone growth impairment. Vitamin D, that's very classic problem with soft bones or birds that their legs don't develop well if they have a shortage of vitamin D. Vitamin E, we see it's an antioxidant, and so we see some inflammation. Bruising can be associated with it. The same with vitamin K, which is just like us, it's a clotting factor that we need. And then the B vitamins, of course, they all contribute as well to some of the growth and development that our birds have. Oftentimes we'll see these examples, head retraction, and this is a thiamine or vitamin E problem. Sometimes we'll see hemorrhages, porosis, or the condition where the leg of the bird, shown here in the middle, where they essentially lose stability in their legs. And once this happens, you can never fix that problem. It'll always be that way, but it can oftentimes be associated with niacin or B vitamin deficiencies. And this curled toe paralysis, that's a very specific riboflavin vitamin deficiency that often occurs in the hen and then is expressed in the chick. Sometimes it's protein. I showed you some pictures of protein issues before. We know that when the protein's not high enough, we see more cannibalism. And that's what this chart is showing, that birds that have a sufficient amount of protein, the level of cannibalism amongst the flock is greatly decreased. We can see the same thing actually with salt. You can almost use the same graph for salt, just on the opposite scale. Too much salt, or rather not enough salt, and you'll see more cannibalism in the flock. Birds trying to get salt from the blood of others. Minerals, we won't spend much time. They're all important for bone and egg development. All the trace minerals, just like us, they're very important. Of course, calcium and phosphorus are very important component because of egg production, right? And so what's important is that the ratio of calcium and phosphorus is maintained throughout their age. And what we're looking for is about a 1% calcium to 0.5% of phosphorus. So a 2 to 1, that's the ratio we're looking for. And that's important for their diet, no matter what age they are. Now, we need to certainly increase calcium when our birds are laying eggs. They use a lot of that calcium, both not only from their bodies, but from the feed that they consume to lay those shells down, those calcium shells. And so having different size calcium available, meaning different frequency or how long it takes to absorb that calcium, is important by providing different particle size. So for the example, there is using pulverized limestone, and then also having oyster shell available to the hens to consume as they want. Probably the most important ingredient that is often the least talked about is water. I can't stress enough how important good, clean water is. And it's essential for every biological organism, us, chickens, bacteria, everybody needs water. And so making sure that our birds have plenty of good, clean water is really important. Now, personally, out of all the ways to water your birds, I like these nipple drinking systems the best. Shows here, these are a little bit high, actually. They shouldn't be that high for these chicks. They should be a little bit lower. But they learn very quickly. They can learn at day of age that when they peck that trigger on that nipple drinker, they'll get a drop of water. And so and it's a really good way of delivering clean and often more cool water that way than any other way that we can in our backyard. Now, birds are they're going to consume by weight twice as much water as the amount of feed that they eat. They can't swallow that feed and digest the feed if they don't have water. So, 2 to 1, 2 parts water for every part of feed. And so very, very important. And it's also a very important part of their evaporative system. Birds don't sweat. They evaporate water out. That's why you see birds panting, essentially. That's how they release heat through that evaporative process. And so very important that they have plenty of water, particularly during times of heat. So essentially what we've gone through then is the different components of a diet, and these are very typical poultry diet components of the diets that of the feed that you'll purchase in the store. And that is probably the number one thing I want you to come away with is that you should be buying feed from a store. That's probably the number one thing. Because too often the problem is we're not feeding, we're feeding the wrong feed. Remember, we talked about starch. Chickens need things that have a lot of starch in them and not a lot of fiber. If we're feeding too much fiber, it's not doing our birds any good. And then the other problem is not feeding enough of the right feed. Remember, those birds are going to consume as much energy as they need. They essentially will self-regulate themselves based on energy. And so if they have enough feed, enough of the right feed, then they're going to produce the eggs and the meat that we're looking for. Now, scratch feed, and I don't know why this is still sold in stores, but scratch feed is not good chicken feed. Now, I'm going to qualify that a little bit. It is corn and wheat and sorghum and, sunflower seeds and things like that. But it is historically deficient in protein. Generally, scratch feed is about 8 to 9% protein. Remember, chicks need at least 22% to start with. And then laying hens need at least 16%. So we're at least have half as much protein in scratch feed as we need. And they're often deficient in minerals and vitamins as well. So scratch feed is not complete nutrition for chickens. And let's just skip over. This is kind of showing the protein requirements. We've already talked about those. But I think I had another slide on scratch feed. Well, maybe I didn't. So there's nothing wrong then in the end of feeding scratch feed because it does have some of those components. But I want you to think of scratch feed as dessert. If you like feeding your chickens by hand, make it dessert. Make it be dessert for them. Make sure they have plenty of good quality, well-balanced poultry feed that they consume. And then when you want to feed them by hand or something like that, give them some treats. Consider that as dessert and not the food that they consume for the day. Okay, a lot of people don't realize how much feed it takes to grow birds. And this is showing, for example, here, a brown egg layer. And this is from day of age through 70 weeks. So they've gone through a complete lay cycle for a 70-week period. And over that period of 70 weeks, they have consumed 124 pounds of feed. So each chicken on its own will consume over that period 124 pounds of feed. So you need to keep that in mind as you prepare for your small flocks, and knowing that feed is a critical component and a major component from an economic standpoint. So which method is best for chickens? Eating off the ground, feed them scratch feed every once in a while, then let them forage, or giving them a complete feed that they can have access to. And of course, the answer is to have a complete feed. And then, feed them by hand if you wanted to give them a little bit of dessert and some treats on occasion. The types of feeders and waters that you can purchase, are many and varied. I like these up here. These are some examples, and there are all kinds of different ones out there. These actually came from Australia, and this is the feeder, which has a little cover in. The chickens can't waste the feed, and then they have a little drinking cup that they can drink out of. Remember, I showed you those nipple drinkers. I prefer those. This is a homemade feeder out of PVC pipe, and you can see look at all the wastage that's happening with this feed that won't essentially won't be consumed by the bird. So the kind of feeder you use is going to be important for how well your feed is delivered and how fresh it is really, and if it's kept the rain is kept out of it, and the birds and mice and that kind of thing. This feeder down here is called a treadle feeder, and the chickens learn to step on this pedal. It opens up the lid, they can eat the feed, and then when they step off the pedal, it covers it up. And that's a good way of keeping rodents and wild birds and things out of the feed as well. I've seen examples of people making them out of wood and things such as that. So that's kind of a neat little kind of a pasture-based feeder that some people have. So again, water being very important. Again, I like these nipple drinkers, and that you can make your own. You can buy the parts through some of these supply catalogs. Some will even probably sell the complete system already. These bell drinkers, there's nothing wrong with a bell drinker other than the fact, of course, that you have to clean that trough out very frequently to make sure they have good clean water. The water in that trough gets dirty in a hurry once they start eating it or consuming that water, because every time they put their beak in, if there's a manure or there's feed on their beak, then it gets into the water. So the importance of good nutrition certainly can't be overstated. And if we want our chickens to give us good meat, nutritious eggs, that kind of thing, we need to make sure that they have the best diets that we can provide them. And again, that's why it's important that we have a balanced, well-balanced, essential, with all the essential nutrients that are in it that we feed our chickens. And so again, I strongly encourage you, as you have your backyard flock, that you purchase feed from a good supplier, and all the farm supply stores are going to have good quality feeds that should meet all of the nutrient requirements. And so I certainly encourage you to buy those kinds of feeds. And again, feed's going to be about 70% of the expense of having your backyard flock. And so, I guess my parting comment is to invest well, because good nutrition is going to make the difference between having healthy birds and birds that don't perform to the best that they can. So that's what I have for you tonight. Let me stop sharing and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ritz. We actually do have a bunch of questions for you. If you don't mind, I'm going to go back to the beginning here. So the first ones that we had been mentioned, we had a couple people right at the beginning mention crop or impacted crop or sour crop. And if you I know that you talked about the crop organ.
Yeah.
But if you just want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that often, sour crop often is a case of a yeast infection. And sometimes that can happen with birds, and it can be, it's something that can be, a medication can be used, but for simple terms, it's a yeast infection in the crop. That's what's happening there.
So Jay has a couple good questions about salmonella. He says, in summer, you always have news about the increase in salmonella outbreaks. And is this because of people not washing their hands or using the foot washes? How do you protect your flock from salmonella? And then he has another question. I'll ask them both at the same time. He says, what happens to the chicken whenever they have the salmonella? Are they just a carrier, or are they actually ill?
Yeah, very good questions. There's about there's over 200 varieties of salmonella. I might even be wrong by a decimal point throughout the world. So there are salmonellas throughout the world. but there are only about 20 of them that can impact human health. And most of them don't impact animals or birds at all. Now, there is really only one salmonella, it's called pylori, that can cause a problem with poultry. But poultry, like other animals, can be carriers of these bacteria that then can become a human health concern. So number one, they're a carrier for salmonella. And most hatcheries, I would dare say that all the available hatcheries that are online, the commercial hatcheries that are reputable, they are part of the National Poultry Improvement Program that makes sure that the flocks are free of Salmonella pylori, which causes the problem in the birds. So they're carriers. They can be carriers. They're not always carriers of the types of salmonella that can impact humans. So, that's why sanitation is very important. You keep your coops clean. You minimize the buildup of manure. You keep rodents and pests out of the feed because they can carry different types of salmonella into your flock. And so sanitation is the number one thing to help minimize salmonella. And the likelihood, if you have a good sanitation program, the likelihood that you'll have a issue with your eggs or your meat is reduced. But then the final bit of advice too then is you always cook chicken completely. You always cook your eggs completely. And then salmonella is not an issue.
We had a couple comments about diatomaceous earth. And I know we've touched on that in a couple of the past webinars, but we had another question about, is that as acceptable as a natural dewormer, or does it have any uses in that way?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have any research to back up those claims. It's also been used, I would say you could probably use it in a mix with some ash or some sand as for external parasites. From an internal parasite or worm treatment, your birds probably can't consume enough of it in order to be effective. Because really, diatomaceous earth, it works on the function of being it's tiny little pieces of sharp, broken skeleton from these little microscopic organisms. So it's skeletal bone pieces and the idea is that it ruptures the cells of parasites, and then that kills them. That's why if you get diatomaceous earth on a bug or something, or on your skin, you can it can be an irritant, and that's what it's supposed to do. So really, I don't think your birds can consume enough for it to be effective, but I'm sure there's some remedies out there that would prescribe it, but I don't have anything on that to contribute, really.
Dylan wanted to know if there was any benefits from fermenting chicken feed prior to feeding it to them.
Yeah, I've heard of that, and I read an article too about it. The only thing, what fermenting does, it's breaking down cellulose, essentially. And if you remember, birds really can't utilize cellulose. They need that starch. So in fermenting, if one of our end products from fermenting is an increased level of starch, then that would be good. But if we're starting with a feed stuff that already is lower, it has lower digestibility or lower utilization from those birds, then we might not really be enhancing it any more than maybe we're raising it to a level that they finally can utilize it, but I don't know if we're really enhancing it because it might already be something they can't use well.
Liz wants to know, how early do you recommend adding multivitamin to the bird's diet?
Day of hatch.
Immediately. Okay.
Yeah, they need a complete diet immediately. They need all those vitamins and minerals right off the bat because they're developing bone and muscle and feathers and everything. So right from the start.
Kim has some questions about pirosis. How would that occur if they're being fed a commercial ration? And how do you avoid over supplementing? Oh no, I'm sorry. This is kind of a separate question. She wants to know how do you avoid over supplementation of calcium if you're using like a commercial layer and oyster shell?
Okay. Well, pirosis shouldn't happen if they're feeding a complete diet. So that really is only going to happen if those diets are deficient in those fat soluble vitamins that they need. So shouldn't be an issue with any commercial diets. What was your second question?
I'm sorry. How do you avoid over supplementing calcium if you're using a commercial layer plus oyster shell?
I don't know if you really need to worry about it. The birds will kind of consume as much as they need. So if you have a commercial diet that should have all the calcium based on that level of production, and then if you supplement with like a oyster shell that you don't include in the feed, you can have just like essentially a tub of oyster shell that they have access to. Then they can consume the calcium that they want, and so you don't need to worry about a condition if there is such a thing as over calcium in the diet there.
So is it okay to add wheat germ oil to a scratch feed? Is it a supplement other than layer feed?
Well, certainly it'd be a supplement, but I still wouldn't, even though you're adding wheat germ oil to scratch feed, that's not sufficient. Scratch feed is just too deficient in all the essential nutrients that is needed. So again, even though you're supplementing it, I would still consider it to be dessert.
And the final question that I have right now is, can just one bird show signs of nutritional deficiency in the flock?
Well, that's a good question. Sometimes, well, I would say that the answer would be that there's probably some other underlying issue that would make that bird go off its feed, and so it would make it look like it has malnutrition. So there might be something else in its system that's impacting its ability to or desire to eat feed. So really, other than those underlying conditions, there's no reason why a bird, if you have a complete diet, they all should respond to it, and you shouldn't have some. Well, I'll take it back a little bit too. You also have the pecking order, right? You have the pecking order in a flock, and that's why it's important that you provide enough feed, because those dominant birds, those dominant hens, are going to eat first. And so you need to make sure that when those dominant hens are done, that the number twos and number threes can come in and get all the food they need too. So maybe I guess that the answer would be is if you're not providing enough feed for the whole entire flock, yeah, there could be an issue because of that pecking order.
Got some bullies pushing them out there.
Oh yeah, it's that's right.
Okay, we've actually had a couple more questions come in. Kim asks could a coccidostat contribute to pirosis like it does for wry neck?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. I only pretend to be a veterinarian on occasion. I'm not really one, so I'm not sure about that.
All All right. Let's see. This sounds like a vet question, but we'll read through it here anyway. Tanya wants to know, she says, I'm not sure if this was discussed, but could you speak to nutrition as connected to a layer becoming egg bound? One of the layers in our small flock was laying internally, and her abdomen became swollen. And finally, when she was defecating, she got caught in her feathers. We increased available calcium, but she never started laying again. She says months and months later, she's still kicking, but she's not been laying.
Yeah, sometimes those internal layers, it's a malfunction of the reproductive tract. And, you see it all the time, really, the weird eggs that people have on occasion, that reproductive tracts of hens are, they're not a machine. They're a biological organism. And so all kinds of things can happen. So, the viscosity, and we see that with the work that I've done has been with wheat diets. And wheat, because of the glycans and the xylans that are in that, can, if you feed too much, it essentially gums up the excreta, or the digestive fluid that goes through the bird. It makes it more viscous, and so that can create issues where you can get birds that get backed up, and so that becomes a problem when we feed too much fiber, particularly too much fiber to the bird. And that's where, example of the wheat diet, there's too much fiber if we feed too much wheat. So yeah, that's we can see all kinds of different issues, not only physiologically, but sometimes the nutrition can create some of these problems as well.
Oh, that's the end of the questions that I have from everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ritz, for this evening's presentation.
Absolutely.
You all, if you haven't already, take a few moments and please fill out the survey for tonight's webinar. It's in the chat. I can repost it. But that's all that I have for this evening, and we'll be here next week again if you guys want to come back for the final session.
Carol, have you talked with Dr. Dunkley about that?
I have not.
Oh, okay. Well then, yeah, I'll make sure that she's on board, or I'll be doing it again.
Okay.